Okay, we are back and done some panel alignment on the hood. So going back to the previous video, the hood was going back that way to the fender and didn't have a flush line up. We also had bad gaps on this side. We had a pretty nice gap on this side, but we were also a little too far front with the hood here. The back of the hood is dropping down flush with the fender, much better than it was. So some of the steps that had to be taken were I initially adjusted my right side hood bolts to get the hood to move back and get my front gap or my front edge flush. That also tightened up my gap here, which became a problem. To lower the back half of the hood, you basically want to make the hinge go in a downward angle, because when the hinge collapses, as it collapses, it's going to go on an angle towards the back, and that's pulling the back of the hood. Now, the other thing to remember with the hinges is when you're adjusting them up and down per se, that also will pull the hood front or back. Obviously, if you tilt it on an angle back, it's going to pull the hood back, which will then you'll have to go back to your bolts here and readjust the hood to the hinge. So that was a few steps I took there. The next step was that the hood, when closed, was very tight on this side. No matter what I could do, it was out of adjustment. So these three bolts I took out, and I used my handy dandy carbide burr bit, and I allocated the holes, or ground a little off each side, so that this fender could move over slightly this way. They were the factory holes, and there wasn't any more room for adjustment. When you're doing that, another thing to keep in mind is with the liners on, the liners should be on when you're doing this part of the job, but these bolts here I also had to loosen to allow the fender to move as much as it's gonna move, which isn't a whole lot. So we did that, got the fender over slightly, and I was still tight on the gap here. I was tight, actually tight all the way up the fender. We'll get to that later. But I had pretty much no gap here, and about a 1/4 inch or more up here, and less towards the back, which told me that this fender was angled towards the left side of the car. This fender back here was also pulled all the way in, as you can see Now my fender's sticking out a little past my door, which I'll have to adjust the door that's coming next. But I added an extra shim in here to then move the fender out towards the right to achieve that gap towards the back. Now I got a good gap here, I got a good gap on that side, but the front gaps are still too tight and too loose. So essentially now I have to move the entire front end of the car, meaning this fender and this fender simultaneously. And that's where my ratchet strap comes into play. Loosen the rad support bolts right there. Loosen those, and I put a strap here between the frame and the rad support, and I crank the whole rad support over, which is going to pull that fender to the right and this fender to the right. And now I created an acceptable gap and a more even gap. And that's just the hood. The other thing that was happening was when I would close the hood, I was kind of tight in the center. It was almost as if this line or this fender edge was curved, but it's really not. What's happening is these bolts were loose, and it was allowing this edge and this fender, this part of the fender, to basically roll, which if this edge here is going down, this edge here is coming in. So I put a hood prop between the rad support, you can see the marks yet, rad support and the hood, and jacked up on the hood, which when you jack up on the hood, it puts pressure on the hinge, picking up the fender, rolling this edge back. With that pressure on that, I then went back and tightened these bolts, and that kept the fender and the liner in place, and it keeps it from moving, side to side. So that makes this edge, become basically straight again. One issue I found is this bolt hole here. You can see the black Sharpie marker. That's because with the fender bolts in, I cannot get this bolt started. I have no idea why. There's no shims behind here, but it's showing that the fender is too far front and needs to come back. So after the fender's off, I'm gonna just allocate this hole a little bit to give me some more room so I can get the bolt in. So there's our hood. Didn't really adjust this fender really at all. This one was pretty good. This whole side's pretty good. This right side was the issue. I'll have to do a little bit of body work up here because this is kind of beat up and doesn't really line up with my hood really good, or my fender really good. Now the doors are going to be next. This door is all out of whack now that, especially now that I moved the fender out. So didn't line up back here as well, but most of the adjustment we're going to be doing is with the bolts on the hinge into the door to get the in and out adjustment. The bolts on the hinges going onto the pillar are what control the door going front to back, but that gap is good. It's just the in and out that is the problem. So that's going to be next. See how it goes. All right, I'm all done with panel alignment. Now there are some issues, one of which is this gap back here is way too tight, and that's fine for now. And as you can see, this gap is kind of big. And here, normally we want our door edge right to the front of the rocker here. So it's a little bigger than what it should be, and that gap is a little tighter than what it should be. The problem is, to make this door go front, you have to be able to access the bolts that are way in there. Now, I was able to loosen all the bolts with a long ratchet and a 1/2 inch and then a gear wrench to do some adjustments, but I could only get it so far, and once I got it to this point I realized my alignment is fine, it's just too far back. But overall the alignment works out. I also had to adjust on these bolts to get my in and out adjustment on the door so it would line up with the fender. And that is close. It's a little in at the bottom. A lot of times what will end up happening anyway is once you put a weather strip on, the weather strip can kind of help that issue by kind of squeezing the door out. Plus there is a little bit of wiggle room down here to move it out just a little bit more. So we're close enough to continue on the project without, I don't really want to have to tear the whole front end off. That's a problem with these GM cars as opposed to the Fords, is hood has to come off, hinges, fender, everything has to come off to get to the door hinges, where a Ford, in most cases, you can just pull the fender off by itself because the hood hinges are on an inner apron and the hood can stand alone. Now this door, I didn't even mess with this door. I noticed earlier that this was low. All these lines, the door is lower than the fender. The fender under here has no shims in it, so the fender isn't picked up. And back here, I also noticed, I didn't take the striker off, but the door closes nicely, which tells me that the striker's in the right spot. But the door is also slightly lower than the quarter, and looking at the bottom gap, The bottom gap, again, it's hard to tell exactly with this camera, but the bottom gap is a little tighter than what it could be. So hence, see, we're a little bit low. We're a little bit low, the door to the quarter. So basically what has to happen is the door hinges, both of the hinges on the pillar have to be adjusted up. Again, I can't do that minus taking the whole front end of the car apart, and at this stage of the game it's really not necessary to take that all apart, move the door, and then put it back. It's not going to prove anything. I kind of know where I have to go when that time comes. So for now, I'm happy with all the panel alignment, and it's going to be basically where it stands. I'm going to grab a sander or two and start. I'm going to actually block sand with an orbital block. I'm going to block sand all this primer. I don't know how much is on it, how much is going to sand before I start burning through at the uneven spots, but I'm going to start blocking this out and see what kind of signs it gives me as far as needed body work. Like I showed in the earlier video, there's some damage on the door here, some dings and dents here and there. Not terrible overall. This quarter on the right side has a little bit of an oil can effect going on, so I'm going to have to probably heat shrink some spots on that to get that to stop oil canning. You can't just put plastic over the low spot in the oil can, because with temperature the metal can expand and contract and move, and you can delaminate your body filler. So that's a no-no. You don't want to do that. Fenders look really good. They shouldn't be a big issue. The doors overall are in nice shape. Just getting this, getting these quarters the way they're supposed to be is going to be the biggest challenge on this car. So that is panel alignment. The next step is, before sanding, I should say, the next step is covering up all the customer's work, covering up the engine bay, covering up the dash, laying some plastic inside the trunk just to keep the dirt to a minimum, keep it under control. Less cleanup in the end that way. So that's where this is. I'm going to get to sanding, and when it's time to show some of the next steps, that's when I'll put another video together. So once again, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, comment, complain, whatever the case. And see you next time.